Jenna adjusted her scarf tighter around her neck as the evening chill settled in. The streets were unusually quiet, and the weak glow of flickering streetlights did little to pierce the encroaching darkness. As she left the corner cafe where she worked the closing shift, she double-checked her phone. Battery at 3%. Not enough for a call. She'd have to hurry home. Her footsteps echoed off the walls of the narrow alleyway she took to cut time. That was when she first saw it, a flicker of bright colour in the corner of her eye. She paused, turning toward the source. Just beyond the edge of the alley, illuminated faintly by a streetlight, was a figure dressed as a clown. Its costume was dirty, the colours dulled by grime and filth. But the face, white paint cracked and peeling, grinned back at her. Jenna swallowed hard, forcing herself to believe it was some prankster or a drunk playing dress-up. She picked up her pace. For the next few nights, the same thing happened. No matter where Jenna went, she caught glimpses of that grotesque face, a flash of colour disappearing around a corner, a fleeting reflection in a shop window. Every time she tried to confront it, the figure vanished into the shadows. Her friends laughed it off, suggesting she'd been watching too many late-night thrillers. But the dread clawing at her gut told her otherwise. 3 weeks passed, and the sightings became more frequent. The clown was no longer content to merely linger on the edges of her vision. It crept closer each night. One evening, as she hurried through the alleyway, she heard a sound that sent a chill racing down her spine, a low, raspy chuckle. She spun around, and there it was. 10 feet away, the figure stood motionless, its head tilted, as if studying her. The grin on its face was wrong. It stretched too far, revealing yellowed, jagged teeth. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound brave. The clown took a step forward, its joints cracking loudly. It was an unnatural sound, like bones grinding together. Jenna's feet refused to move. The creature took another step, and then another. When it finally lunged, she stumbled backward, crashing into a row of trash cans. By the time she scrambled to her feet, it had disappeared. Sleep became impossible. Jenna installed new locks, barricaded her windows, but nothing kept the nightmares or reality at bay. She spoke to the police, but without tangible evidence, they dismissed her fears. The stress wore her down, and paranoia bled into her daily life. The worst part was how her own mind began to betray her. Was it all in her head? One night, as the wind howled through empty streets, Jenna's senses prickled. She was being watched. Turning slowly, she saw it again, standing right outside her apartment window. The clown's grin stretched impossibly wide. She grabbed the nearest heavy object, a metal lamp, and ran outside, determined to end this nightmare. But as she burst through the door, it was gone. Exhaustion gave way to a kind of grim resolve. She began researching, uncovering whispers of an old asylum nearby. Decades ago, patients had been abandoned when funding was cut, left to fend for themselves. Rumours swirled of grotesque experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, procedures meant to alter physiology and neural functions, leaving survivors with twisted bodies and fractured minds. The clown, it seemed, was a remnant of that horror, a victim turned predator. The next encounter was her last. Jenna had taken to carrying a knife, her fingers always on edge. She was walking home when the streetlights flickered and died. A cold wind brushed against her cheek. The laughter, deep, guttural and close, sent her heart racing. She spun around, knife raised, and found herself face to face with the painted horror. This time, it didn't move slowly. It lunged, claw-like fingers reaching for her throat. The struggle was brief but violent. Jenna's blade pierced pale flesh, but the creature didn't stop. Its eyes, once so lifeless, burned with a twisted joy. In those final moments, she saw beyond the painted facade. Beneath the madness was a creature warped by nature, stripped of humanity by cruelty and isolation. When they found her body, investigators dismissed the attack as the work of a deranged vagrant. They sealed the asylum once more, but those who lived nearby knew better. At night, when the wind blew just right, a hollow, echoing laugh could still be heard. The laughing shadows were never truly gone. The first whispers of the old circus ground came with a chill. It had been abandoned for decades after a fire ripped through the tents, leaving nothing but charred debris and scattered memories. Local legends spoke of eerie laughter echoing through the woods at night, of eyes watching from the shadows. Teenagers dared each other to venture into the ruins, but few ever admitted to what they saw, if they came back at all. Claire hadn't thought much of the stories until her brother, Jake, vanished. He'd been one of those thrill-seekers, too brave or too reckless for his own good. Weeks passed with no sign of him, and the authorities, too quick to dismiss the case, labelled him as just another runaway. But Claire knew better. She had seen the fear in his eyes the night before he disappeared. Determined, she packed a flashlight and a hunting knife, then made her way through the overgrown path leading to the remains of the circus. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Rusting metal poles jutted from the ground like skeletal fingers, and remnants of tattered banners flapped in the wind. She called Jake's name, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. As darkness crept in, she spotted movement, a flash of colour darting between the ruins. Her grip tightened on the knife, sweat beading on her forehead. "Who's there?" she demanded, straining to keep her voice steady. No response, just a low, raspy giggle carried by the wind. Claire's pulse quickened. Pushing deeper into the grounds, she found a crumbling big top tent. Inside, the floor was littered with discarded props, broken hoops, shattered mirrors and stained costumes. The air was thick with dust, but something else lingered, a metallic tang that set her teeth on edge. Footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, only to see empty darkness. But she wasn't alone. The giggle returned, louder this time, echoing from multiple directions. "Jake!" she whispered, hoping beyond hope. A shadow moved, and from behind a tattered curtain stepped a figure clad in a moth-eaten clown suit. Its makeup was smeared, revealing patches of pale, scarred skin beneath. But what struck Claire was its eyes, yellow, animalistic, and devoid of humanity. It tilted its head, as if amused by her presence. Before she could react, more figures emerged. They were clowns, but not human, not anymore. Decades of isolation and inbreeding had twisted their forms. Limbs were bent at unnatural angles, faces stretched into grotesque masks. They moved like predators, circling her with a mixture of clumsy steps and sudden bursts of speed. This was their home, their hunting ground, and she was trespassing. Claire's breath came in short, ragged gasps. She slashed out with her knife, keeping them at bay, but their numbers grew. One lunged, clawed hands swiping at her arm, leaving deep gashes. Pain flared, but adrenaline kept her moving. She bolted toward the nearest opening, desperate to escape. Outside, the woods seemed to close in, branches clawing at her as she ran. The laughter followed, a cacophony of madness. She stumbled upon an old trailer, its door ajar. Scrambling inside, she locked it behind her and collapsed. The walls were covered in photographs, images of victims dating back decades. At the centre was Jake, eyes wide in terror. Claire choked back a sob, rage and grief threatening to consume her. A loud bang on the door snapped her back to reality. They were here. The walls shook as they pounded, howling and laughing. Claire knew it was only a matter of time. Desperate, she searched the room, finding an old flare gun. When the door finally gave way, she fired, the flare igniting one of the clowns. Its screams pierced the night, and for a moment, chaos reigned. The others recoiled, giving her a chance to flee. Claire didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of town, collapsing from exhaustion. The locals found her the next morning, battered and delirious. She tried to warn them, but fear kept most away from the ruins. A few brave souls ventured in, armed and determined to end the nightmare. They found nothing but ashes. Years later, whispers continued. On moonless nights, some claimed to hear the faint strains of carnival music drifting through the trees, accompanied by hollow laughter. The circus, it seemed, had never truly left. It was waiting for the next foolhardy soul to wander too close. Eddie's fascination with clowns began at a county fair one hot summer when he was 9. He had wandered off to escape the crowd's noise and stumbled upon a small tent hidden behind the main attractions. Inside, a lone clown performed tricks, juggling knives, balancing on a narrow beam, and laughing with a wild abandon that left Eddie both mesmerised and uneasy. When the clown locked eyes with him, Eddie's skin prickled. It wasn't the painted grin that unnerved him. It was the emptiness beneath the surface, like staring into a mask hiding something monstrous. When the fair ended, so did Eddie's carefree childhood. He began seeing glimpses of the clown everywhere, reflected in windows, lingering in alleyways, watching from across crowded streets. His parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. The sightings grew more frequent, each one more brazen than the last. Years passed. Eddie, now in his 20s, had tried to move on, but the nightmares never stopped. The painted face haunted him, its hollow eyes a constant reminder of something left unfinished. He pored over old newspapers, searching for anything that might explain the clown's presence. What he found only deepened his dread. The man in the clown costume, known simply as Lester the Laughing Clown, had vanished shortly after the fair, a mystery that stumped the authorities. Rumours spoke of a drifter, a survivalist who used disguises to evade capture while preying on vulnerable people. Determined to end the nightmare, Eddie tracked down leads to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place local legends called the Laughing Hollow. He carried only a flashlight, a hunting knife, and the weight of years spent fearing shadows. The cabin was decrepit, its walls warped and decaying. Faded circus posters lined the interior, each featuring Lester's painted face. The air was thick with mildew, and the floorboards groaned under Eddie's weight. "Come out," he demanded, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm not afraid of you." A low chuckle resonated from the darkness, sending a cold shiver down his spine. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement. A flash of colour disappearing behind a doorway. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The knife felt small and inadequate in his grip. The clown emerged without warning, lunging from the shadows. Eddie barely managed to sidestep, stumbling backward. Up close, Lester's makeup was smeared, revealing gaunt features beneath. His eyes burned with a feral intensity. Eddie slashed out with his knife, catching Lester's arm. Blood trickled down, but the clown barely reacted. Instead, he laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the cabin. "You think you can end this?" Lester sneered, his voice gravelly. "I've been watching you for so long, Eddie. You're my favourite." Eddie's hands shook, but he steadied himself. He realised, with chilling clarity, that Lester had been more than just a deranged drifter. Years in isolation, surviving on whatever he could find, had twisted his body and mind. His movements were inhuman, joints cracking as he bent and contorted, faster than anyone had a right to be. Eddie swung again, but Lester darted away with an agility that defied logic. The fight turned into a hunt. Lester stalked him through the cabin, using hidden passages and trapdoors. The walls themselves seemed to mock Eddie, plastered with grotesque painted smiles. Each room became a maze of terror. Eddie's breathing grew ragged, his stamina waning. He needed to end it, or he would become another victim, a face in a forgotten newspaper clipping. In the main room, Eddie spotted a rusted lantern and a small container of fuel. Desperation fueled his next move. He grabbed the container, dousing the floor and walls as Lester closed in. The clown's laughter rose to a fever pitch, echoing around him. "You can't escape me, Eddie. This ends here." "No," Eddie whispered, striking a match. "It ends for you." The flames caught quickly, roaring to life. Smoke filled the room, choking off the air. Lester screamed, a sound of rage and agony that reverberated through the cabin. Eddie stumbled out, collapsing on the ground as the inferno consumed the structure. The fire raged into the night, leaving only ashes and silence. In the weeks that followed, Eddie struggled to find peace. He told no one what had happened. The world would dismiss him as mad. But on restless nights, he still heard echoes of that laughter carried by the wind. He knew the truth. Monsters don't die easily, and painted faces have a way of returning when you least expect them. It started with a trail of red noses. In each small town along the old highway, bodies were found, their mouths stuffed with the bright rubber accessories of clowns. Authorities were baffled, but one thing was clear. The killer was methodical. Each victim had been lured, hunted, and dispatched with surgical precision, and the calling card left behind mocked everyone's attempts to understand the horror. Investigative journalist Mia Carter couldn't resist digging deeper. The story had gripped the nation, but for her it was personal. One of the victims was a childhood friend. She vowed to find the monster responsible. Mia's journey led her to a secluded carnival nestled deep in the mountains, a relic from another era. It was said to be abandoned, but as she approached, she saw faint lights flickering within. The air was thick with rot and mildew. Rusting rides stood as grotesque monuments to forgotten joys, their creaks echoing like ghostly wails. A painted sign, faded and peeling, greeted her. "Welcome to the Last Laugh Carnival." She moved cautiously, every step a deliberate attempt to mask her presence. Mia's instincts screamed at her to leave, but she pushed forward. Her flashlight flickered over grotesque clown mannequins that lined the paths, some shattered and forgotten, others eerily lifelike. One of them shifted slightly. Mia's breath caught, but when she turned back, it hadn't moved again. It was just nerves, or so she hoped. She reached the heart of the carnival, a massive tent with frayed red and yellow stripes. Inside, the stench of decay grew stronger. The walls were lined with crude drawings, faces contorted in agony, mouths stretched into wide painted grins. In the centre stood a tall, gaunt figure, clad in a filthy clown suit. His makeup was caked on thick, but beneath it, Mia saw hints of mottled, scarred skin. He turned slowly, eyes blazing with something feral. "Welcome, guest," he crooned, voice dripping with mockery. "I've been expecting you." Mia's grip tightened on the small revolver in her pocket. "You're the one killing people," she accused, her voice trembling only slightly. The clown tilted his head, as if considering her words. "Killing?" he mused. No. I liberate them from their masks." His smile widened, revealing sharpened teeth, filed down like those of a predator. She didn't wait for him to move. Mia fired, but he was fast, inhumanly so. He dodged, closing the distance between them in a blur. His hands clawed at her, nails sharp enough to pierce flesh. She stumbled backward, tripping over something soft. Her flashlight illuminated a pile of bodies, each victim arranged in grotesque poses, red noses gleaming from their mouths. The clown loomed over her. "We are all performers," he whispered, "but some of us shed our masks." His body was twisted, limbs unnaturally long. Mia realized with dawning horror that he wasn't alone. Shadows moved within the tent. Other clowns, disfigured and silent, emerged from the darkness. They were followers, remnants of a twisted circus cult. Exposure to a toxic spill from a chemical dump near the carnival decades ago had warped their bodies and minds, driving them to madness. They had been forgotten, left to fester in their isolation. Now they exacted their revenge. Mia crawled away, gasping for breath. She kicked over a lantern, spilling burning oil across the ground. Flames licked at the edges of the tent. The clowns hesitated, their eyes flickering between rage and fear. In that moment, Mia ran. The fire roared to life, consuming everything in its path. Outside, she collapsed, watching as smoke billowed into the night sky. The sounds of screams and crackling fire mixed into a cacophony of chaos. The authorities arrived hours later. They found ashes and scorched earth, but no bodies. Officially, the case remained unsolved. But Mia knew they were still out there, lurking in forgotten places. On quiet nights, when the wind was just right, she heard faint laughter echoing in the distance. She knew the painted trail wasn't over. It had simply gone deeper underground, waiting for its next curtain call. Every year, the town of Hollow's End celebrated its heritage with the Silent Parade, a bizarre procession where dozens of clowns, dressed in intricate, colourful costumes, marched silently through the streets at night. No one remembered exactly when the tradition began, but it was considered a point of pride. Tourists flocked to watch, unaware of the sinister truth lurking beneath the painted faces. Oliver had always hated the parade. Something about it felt off. The clowns moved too stiffly, their steps too synchronized, their silence oppressive. As a child, he'd clutched his mother's hand tightly, unnerved by their painted eyes that never blinked. Now, as an adult, he had little choice but to attend when his friend Mark insisted they go together. Mark was an outsider, new to Hollow's End, and enamoured with its strange traditions. That night, the streets were packed. The crowd whispered excitedly, but as the clock struck midnight, a hush fell. The clowns emerged from the shadows, one by one, their faces painted in elaborate designs. They moved in perfect unison, their footsteps eerily quiet against the cobblestones. Oliver's skin prickled. He tried to shake it off, just old fears resurfacing, he told himself. But something was different this year. As the parade passed, one clown paused. It turned its head toward Oliver, its painted grin wide and grotesque. Beneath the makeup, its eyes were dull and lifeless. It wasn't a person. Oliver's breath caught. He grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to go," he whispered. But his friend laughed it off, mesmerized by the spectacle. When the last clown passed, the crowd erupted in applause. Oliver pulled Mark aside, desperate to explain what he saw. "They're not people," he insisted. "At least not all of them." Mark scoffed, but Oliver couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they walked home, he caught glimpses of painted faces in alleyways, shadows that lingered too long. By the time they reached Oliver's apartment, he was sweating, his heart pounding. That night, a noise woke him, scratching at the window. He sat up, straining to see through the darkness. A silhouette moved outside. Slowly, a painted face pressed against the glass. Its mouth moved, but no sound came. Oliver stumbled backward, grabbing his phone, but the screen flickered and died. The power was out, the scratching grew more frantic, and then silence. He waited, holding his breath. Minutes passed. Finally, he approached the window, but the clown was gone. In its place was a small red balloon tied to the latch. On it, scrawled in dripping red letters, "Join us." The next morning, Mark was missing. The authorities dismissed it as a prank gone wrong, another tourist who'd wandered too far. But Oliver knew better. Determined to find his friend, he traced the parade's route through old maps and forgotten records. What he uncovered was chilling. Decades ago, a mining disaster had contaminated the town's water supply. Those exposed suffered grotesque mutations, twisted limbs, discoloured skin, and loss of speech. Ashamed, the town hid them away, creating the silent parade as a cover, a ritual to appease the forgotten, mutated survivors who still lived beneath the streets. Armed with this knowledge, Oliver descended into the tunnels beneath Hollow's End. The air was thick with rot and moisture. He moved cautiously, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Painted faces leered from every wall, and the deeper he went, the louder the sound of breathing became, laboured, inhuman. In a cavernous chamber, he found them, the silent ones. They moved with mechanical precision, their painted faces grotesque masks, hiding disfigured features. Mark was there, bound and painted, his eyes wide with terror. The leader of the silent ones, a towering figure with a cracked porcelain mask, stepped forward. It gestured, and the others closed in. Oliver realised with sickening clarity that the parade wasn't just a show. It was a ritual, a means to add new members to their ranks. Fighting panic, Oliver freed Mark. Together they fled through winding tunnels, the silent ones in pursuit. Their movements were methodical, relentless. Finally, they reached a collapsed passageway. Oliver turned, desperate to buy time. He hurled his flashlight, shattering the porcelain mask of the leader. Beneath, a face twisted by years of exposure glared back, eyes filled with pain and rage. The distraction was enough. They scrambled through the narrow gap, sealing it behind them. Days later, the town claimed the tunnels had collapsed, and the silent parade continued as planned. But Oliver knew it was a lie. On the night of the next parade, he packed his bags. As he drove away, he glanced in his rear-view mirror. Painted faces lined the road, unmoving, their silent eyes watching him leave. In the small, mist-covered town of Elk Grove, there had always been rumours of the Night Whisperer, a shadowed figure that preyed on late-night travellers along the old forest roads. People assumed he was a ghost or figment of local lore until the first body turned up. Evan Mallory was on his way home from his night shift at the paper mill, driving down one of those winding, desolate roads. His headlights caught the figure of a man standing in the middle of the road, arm raised, asking for help. Evan pulled over, thinking the stranger was simply in need, but when he rolled down his window, the man silently approached, holding nothing but a thin, gleaming blade. With a swift, horrifying motion, the maniac reached through the open window, slashing Evan's neck. He moved quickly, controlled, as if he'd done this many times before. Evan bled out within moments, unable to scream as his killer whispered, "I set you free." The man calmly dragged Evan's body out of the car, leaving it by the roadside as if it were a deer hit by a passing truck. Authorities found Evan's body the next morning, his car untouched, his belongings still there. No fingerprints, no sign of robbery, only the eerie message written in Evan's blood on the car window, "I set him free." The killer's motive, as authorities discovered from his pattern of victims, seemed to centre on random rescues of people he deemed as trapped in their lives, making him an unpredictable, twisted saviour. Anyone who appeared to be struggling or leading a repetitive life, like Evan, was a potential target in his mind. Several weeks later, another body was found in a similar state, a woman who worked 2 jobs and was returning home after a late shift. The killer struck on isolated roads, seeking out lonely, unsuspecting souls, approaching with that same silent, calm demeanour and leaving the same blood-written message. Over time, the town grew wary, and fewer people dared to drive alone at night. The police searched for months, but no one matched the sparse description given by the few who'd glimpsed him. They only knew he was a man of medium build, always wearing a wide-brimmed hat to hide his face. He was like a ghost that melted into the shadows. To this day, the story of the Night Whisperer is whispered around Elk Grove, a warning for anyone tempted to pull over on a deserted road after dark. They say he's still out there, waiting for someone he believes needs his twisted kind of freedom. Lily worked late shifts at a small convenience store, her manager always saying it was the safest neighbourhood in town. She didn't believe it. The store was quiet, often deserted by 1 a.m, with only the occasional night owl or weary truck driver stopping by. One night, a man entered around 2 a.m, hood pulled low, hands in his pockets. He moved slowly, aimlessly, circling the aisles as if looking for something he'd lost. Lily felt an inexplicable dread. There was something off about him, something predatory in the way he glanced around the store. He finally approached the counter, buying nothing more than a pack of gum. His gaze lingered on her a little too long, his smile unnerving. "See you around, Lily," he said. Her name tag had been tucked into her apron. How did he know her name? As he left, she locked the doors, her hands shaking. She wanted to call her manager, but she didn't want to appear paranoid. She resumed her shift, counting down the minutes until dawn. Then, as she glanced at the store's front, she saw him standing across the street, watching her from the shadows. The next few nights were the same. He would show up around 2 a.m, wandering the aisles, leaving without buying anything. She'd started keeping a baseball bat behind the counter, her anxiety mounting each night. She reported him to her manager, who only shrugged, claiming he was just a harmless customer. One evening, she saw him waiting for her in the parking lot, eyes glinting in the dark. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The officers brushed it off, saying they'd patrol the area, but couldn't do much unless he posed an immediate threat. The next night, he didn't show up. Lily felt relieved, but the relief didn't last. As she locked up the store and walked to her car, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, gripping her keys, but no one was there. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, her instincts screaming danger. As she reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, dropping them in her panic. When she bent to pick them up, she saw his reflection in her car window. He'd been waiting for her, biding his time until he could get close enough. Her scream pierced the night, but in the empty parking lot, no one was around to hear. The police found her car the next morning, her belongings scattered, but Lily was gone. Her stalker had left nothing behind but a chilling reminder of how quietly someone's life could be invaded, watched, and ultimately taken by a stranger who'd appeared as harmless as any other customer. In the dimly lit corner of the Quiet Pint, a tucked-away bar known for its warm wooden decor and vintage charm, Rick was on his usual shift. Rick was a man who knew how to blend in. He was charming, unassuming, and always seemed ready with a sympathetic ear for anyone down on their luck. He'd been a bartender for years, but before that, he'd been a butcher in a small town, learning the intricacies of cutting, filleting, and preservation. Those skills, honed over decades, served him well in ways that no one could ever suspect. Rick had an eye for people, especially the ones who sat alone, swirling their drinks with that telltale weariness that spoke of loneliness or heartbreak. He knew what to say, just enough to get them talking, letting them unwind with a laugh here, a shared story there. Most nights his bar would start with casual chatter, but as it grew late the atmosphere softened and Rick would make his move. Tonight, it was Lauren. She was a pretty young woman with a distracted look, scrolling on her phone while nursing a vodka tonic. He noticed the faint smudge of mascara under her eye, a quiet tell of a night gone wrong. As he polished a glass, he threw her a gentle smile. "Long night?" he asked, his voice soothing and genuinely concerned. She looked up, surprised by his tone, then nodded with a sad smile. "You could say that." He kept their conversation light, offering her another drink on the house. That was the trick. He always made sure they were comfortable, as though they were just two friends sharing a night out. He never pushed, only nudged. And by the time she was finishing her third drink, she was visibly relaxed, the weight of her earlier sadness visibly softened. "I'm closing up soon," Rick mentioned casually. "Want a nightcap at my place? It's close by." Lauren hesitated for a second, glancing around the emptying bar before nodding. He'd done this enough times to know when someone was about to say yes. The walk to his apartment was short. Once inside, he offered her another drink, lacing it with just enough sedative to make her groggy. The familiarity of his kitchen put him at ease, and he found himself moving with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. By the time she realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Lauren's limbs felt heavy, her vision swimming. She tried to protest, but the words slurred, half-formed and incoherent. Rick merely watched her struggle for a moment, his eyes cold and calculating, a far cry from the bartender's charm he wore like a mask. As Lauren's body went limp, Rick carried her to a back room, his steps slow and deliberate. He laid her on a metal table he kept hidden behind a locked door in the back, flipping on a single dim light. The room, sterile and lined with plastic, had once been a butcher's prep area, a place for cutting and preparing fine meats. Now, it served a darker purpose. The first cut was always the hardest, but over time, he had mastered the precision it required. His movements were swift, clinical. Each incision was methodical, a habit from years of learning how to break down animal carcasses. He worked quickly, the chilling quiet punctuated only by the metallic clink of his tools. He'd done this enough times to know how to handle every step. The blood drained easily, the limbs separated with precision. After cleaning the remnants, he sealed each part in thick plastic wrap, then carefully stored the packages in an old industrial freezer he'd purchased from a closing butcher's shop. The freezer hummed softly in the corner, his hidden cache of secrets, out of sight and out of mind. The next day, Rick went back to the bar, blending seamlessly with the familiar sights and sounds, wearing that same friendly smile as he wiped down tables, poured drinks, and joked with patrons. He watched as people came and went, their laughter and lives flowing past him in a ceaseless, unknowing tide. And as the hours wore on, he spotted his next lonely soul. A young woman at the far end of the bar, nursing her drink and staring off into space. He'd offer her a drink, start a friendly conversation, and guide her into his web. No one ever noticed, and no one ever questioned the amiable bartender with the gentle eyes. On a rainy night, Sarah rushed out of the bar, clutching her coat as the cold wind bit into her skin. She had missed the last bus home, and the streets were nearly empty. Her phone's battery was almost dead, so calling a rideshare wasn't an option. Then, as if out of nowhere, a taxi's headlights pierced the darkness, pulling to a slow stop beside her. The driver leaned over and rolled down the passenger window. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, with greying hair and glasses perched on his nose. His eyes looked warm, a sharp contrast to the chill night. He smiled, showing slightly crooked teeth, and asked, "Need a ride?" Sarah hesitated, but the rain started falling harder, each drop cutting into her skin like needles. She didn't have the luxury to be picky. Besides, it was just a quick ride back to her apartment. "Yeah, thanks," she said, slipping into the back seat and shutting the door. As they began moving, she noticed a thick scent lingering in the car. It was faintly metallic, mixed with something she couldn't place. Her eyes flicked up to the small mirror where the driver's gaze occasionally darted back at her. He seemed polite enough, glancing only briefly before returning his focus to the road. "So, had a late night?" he asked, his voice gravelly yet gentle. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, just catching up with some friends. Thought I'd catch the bus, but..." She shrugged, giving a nervous laugh. "Guess I missed it." He chuckled too, though his laugh lingered a beat too long. "Lucky for you, huh? Could have been a long walk in this weather. Where to?" She gave him her address, and he punched it into his GPS, but she noticed his fingers trembling ever so slightly. She shifted uncomfortably, her own nerves kicking in. As they rolled down the dark streets, she couldn't shake the strange smell. It reminded her of a meat market she'd visited once, back when she was a child. Trying to steady her nerves, Sarah turned to look out the window, watching as the familiar buildings passed by. But after a few turns, she began to realise they weren't heading in the right direction. She leaned forward, cleared her throat and said, I think we're going the wrong way." He kept driving, ignoring her comment. "Sir," I said, "this isn't the way to my apartment." Her voice wavered. He glanced up in the mirror, his eyes locking onto hers. "Oh, I just thought I'd take a shortcut." His smile was tight, his lips pulling back just enough to reveal those crooked teeth again. "Please," she insisted, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you just take me the normal way?" The man didn't respond, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he took a sudden turn onto a deserted road. Panic started to rise in Sarah's chest. She reached for her phone, only to remember it was almost dead. No signal showed on the screen. Her heart pounded as she scanned the car for anything she could use to defend herself. She noticed his bag on the passenger seat, partially open, revealing a gleaming blade. Her breath hitched. Something was very, very wrong. Desperate, she tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The locks were automatic, trapping her inside. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Let me out!" "Stop the car!" He looked back in the mirror, his warm smile twisted into something predatory. "It's been a long time since anyone's complained about my driving," he said, with an eerie calmness. Adrenaline surged through her veins. "I'll scream," she threatened, voice shaky. "Someone will hear me." "Go ahead," he replied. "No one comes down this road." Her mind raced. She realised she was in the middle of nowhere, miles from anyone who might hear her, but she had no other choice. She screamed, her voice raw, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. The driver only laughed, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the car. "Scream all you want," he said. "It won't change anything." He took another turn, leading them down a winding, forested road. The trees loomed over the car, blocking out the moonlight. Sarah's screams faded into sobs as she tried the door again, desperate to find a way out. They stopped in a clearing, the headlights illuminating an old, run-down cabin. He cut the engine, turned around to face her, and reached into his bag, pulling out a long, gleaming knife. Why are you doing this? She choked out, pressing herself as far back into the seat as possible. The man's expression softened, a twisted form of sympathy in his eyes. They said I was dangerous, he whispered, almost to himself. Said I was better off locked up, kept away from people like you. He tilted his head, regarding her like an insect pinned under a microscope. But I got out. Found a job no one would question. A little ride here, a little ride there. He chuckled, as if it were all a grand joke. And now, here we are. He leaned in closer, the blade catching the faint light. It's just business, he whispered. Sarah's instincts took over. She swung her legs up, kicking him square in the face. His head snapped back, and she took advantage of his surprise, scrambling over the seat and pushing at the front passenger door, praying it would open. It did. She tumbled out onto the ground, skinning her knees, but she didn't care. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around for any path, any way to escape. She heard him cursing, fumbling his way out of the driver's seat. Without looking back, she ran into the trees, branches scratching her face and arms as she sprinted through the undergrowth. The rain had stopped, but the ground was muddy, and her shoes slipped as she tried to keep her balance. Behind her she could hear his footsteps, heavy and relentless. She didn't dare look back, focusing instead on putting as much distance as possible between them. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept running, fueled by pure terror. Then, in the distance, she saw headlights. Another car coming down the road. She screamed, waving her arms frantically, hoping they'd see her. The car slowed, and she stumbled into the road, nearly collapsing in relief. A couple stepped out, their faces twisted in concern as they saw her wild, panicked state. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, reaching out to steady her. Before Sarah could answer, she glanced back and saw him standing at the edge of the trees, watching her with a dark, unreadable expression. But he made no move to approach. She managed to choke out, "Please, he tried to." But when she looked back again, he was gone, vanished into the shadows. The couple hurried her into their car, promising to take her to the nearest police station. She sat in the back seat, trembling, replaying the horror in her mind. And somewhere in the dark of the forest, the man returned to his cab, wiping off the blade, waiting for his next passenger. It started on a cool autumn night, the city streets slick from recent rain. Danny, a drifter down on his luck, was wandering alone, aimlessly. He didn't notice the man watching him, a stranger in a hooded jacket, leaning casually against a street lamp. The man caught Danny's eye, smiled warmly and waved him over. "You look like you could use a little relief," the man said, voice gentle, almost fatherly. "Rough day?" Danny nodded. After some small talk, the man, who introduced himself as Cole, pulled a vial from his pocket. "Here, take the edge off, no charge." Danny hesitated but took a swig, the burn of the liquid soothing, numbing. As the city lights blurred, he felt Cole's hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward a nearby car. When he came to, Danny was strapped tightly to a chair, his limbs heavy and tingling. The room was dim, with bare cement walls and shelves lined with jars of cloudy liquid. He squinted, barely processing that each jar contained a single preserved finger. Cole appeared, his friendly demeanour replaced by a chilling calm. He circled Danny, eyes tracing over him with a detached curiosity. "Loners like you're all the same. Wandering, invisible. No one asks questions when you go missing." He moved to a table lined with tools, blades, small saws, syringes. With a clinical efficiency, he selected a scalpel and leaned in, his voice low and almost tender. "We'll start slow. Just a little pain to keep you aware." He began with shallow cuts along Danny's arms and legs, watching as his eyes widened in agony. As blood pooled, Cole murmured calmly, almost as if talking to himself, "Each of you reacts differently. Some scream, some beg." He grinned, leaning closer. "The best ones, they stay quiet." Danny's muffled cries grew weaker as Cole continued, taking care to avoid any fatal cuts. He wanted his victims to last, savouring their fear and their slow, deliberate suffering. Only when they grew too weak, too close to slipping away, would he retrieve the pair of surgical scissors. With precision, Cole took Danny's left hand and lined up the blades over his index finger. Danny's eyes fluttered as he felt the blades close. Cole hummed a soft tune, his eyes fixed on the finger as he made the final snip, adding the latest souvenir to his collection. He placed it gently in a jar labelled Danny, October 12th. By morning, the room was spotless, every trace of Danny erased. Cole, blending into the crowd once again, returned to the street, his warm smile intact, looking for the next drifter to invite into his collection.